But right now we'll get to Josh Paunil, Eagles 24/7, PhillyMag.com. Joins us talking. Josh, you were on the show a few days ago, but that was before Chip Kelly got fired. So
yeah,
the narrative has changed, to say the least.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what a whirlwind the last few days was. The sentiment, people thought it was more likely Chip would be back next year than not. But even the people that thought he would get fired, I don't think anyone projected it would be on a Tuesday night in the middle of a week before a game. I think that timing, more than anything else, was the most surprising part of how this whole thing went down.
Josh, how did you feel about Jeffrey Lurie's press conference? I felt, watching it, we were broadcasting it here on 97.3 ESPN. I'm watching it, and I felt like at the beginning, he kept it very professional. He kept it very, respectful. But as the press conference progressed, I really felt like Jeffrey Lurie was telling us everything we needed to know why he let go of Chip Kelly.
Yeah, and the thing with that press conference was actually the more that I heard from him, honestly, the more that I kind of disagreed with the decisions that he made because, he mentioned that, he didn't give Chip the option to stay on as head coach without the personal responsibilities. And with all the talk, the last couple of days about, Chip being a dictator, a couple of things on that. First, it was very clear today, the players made it clear that they disagreed with some of the criticism other players made yesterday about Chip and his personality. Malcolm Jenkins, kind of fired back at Lane Johnson's comments. Zach Ertz defended Kelly. So I think it wasn't necessarily as straightforward as Chip being a dictator. But I also think the problem wasn't Chip's relationship with the players, but his personnel moves. I mean, the reason the offense struggled wasn't because, Lane Johnson couldn't come in and talk to him. It's because they have arguably the worst pair of starting guards in the NFL. The receivers aren't any good. They had a new quarterback that had to adjust to the system. So I think it was a mistake by Lurie to not allow Chip another year without the GM responsibilities and to bring someone else in who could improve the personnel.
How much of the issue with the personnel do you think had to do with the relationship between Chip Kelly and Howie Roseman? I've heard from a couple of people today mention the fact that Howie Roseman, really hasn't gotten along with a lot of people in Philadelphia, whether it was Andy Reid or Chip Kelly or others. How much do you think that relationship may have led to this?
That's something that I read today that even Sean McDermott, who is a potential candidate to replace Chip Kelly, his relationship with Howie Roseman in Philly may not have been the greatest. So that's one thing that Lane Johnson said yesterday that tension would trickle down into the locker room. Today, Malcolm Jenkins said Lane's reading too many articles. But I definitely think that it doesn't help when you have these two powerful guys in the organization, and specifically Howie, that just hasn't been getting along with people. That strain is always going to hurt you because even as good of a coach as you may have, there's always going to be an inevitable down period. And when you have that down period and the friction already exists, it's just going to exacerbate the problem.
Jeffrey Lurie talked about where the Eagles are going to go forward from here. Obviously, Howie Roseman seems to be the man in charge. Tom Donahue is going to be kind of like the older advisor, kind of guiding the younger guy. And then the head coach will come in as, like the third mind in the room making decisions. But how much of this do you think has to do with Jeffrey Lurie basically saying, I'm not comfortable with the decision I made and I'm trying to fix it?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it, because that was one thing that Jeffrey Lurie kind of emphasized in his press conference yesterday, that, we made a risky decision and it backfired. And I really think he's trying to do everything he can to prevent the next head coach or the next situation to have similar results. Now, I think you could argue maybe he's taking it too far. Should Howie Roseman have all this power? Will potential coaching candidates like the setup of the power over the personnel? So, it'll be interesting to see if, Jeffrey Lurie accidentally goes too far the opposite way of how he handled Chip Kelly.
We're talking with Josh Paunil here on the Sports Bash, 97.3 ESPN.com. Josh, looking ahead, there actually is a game this Sunday that I think a lot well, it's been kind of forgotten about.
You wouldn't know that.
You wouldn't know that by the media coverage, but there is a game, and even though it doesn't have playoff consequences, there's a lot of interesting elements to this game. Let's first start with the fact that the interim coach is going to be Pat Shurmur.
Yeah, and that's, I don't think I've ever been so excited to see a Pat Shurmur coach the offense. I mean, with Chip Kelly gone, it's really going to be interesting to see, how much is Pat Shurmur going to change, if at all, because he only has, 4 or 5 days, so how much can you really change if he does? But it's also somewhat of an audition for him. He's the interim head coach. I think it's fair to say that he may get interviewed for the coaching job. So does he want to stray and try to impress, Jeffrey Lurie, or is he going to stick with what Chip Kelly implemented? I think he's definitely going to stick with what Chip implemented. You'll see virtually what you normally see. Perhaps you'll see less tempo, but I think it'll be a lot of what you've already seen this season.
How much do you think Pat Shurmur being selected as the interim coach has kind of changed things for the players in the locker room? We've heard from a lot of people saying that the players seem to be rejuvenated. What is the relationship Pat Shurmur has with the players?
Well, I'm not even sure it's as much Pat Shurmur being the interim head coach, but maybe just Chip Kelly and kind of the end of an era. The word that DeMarco Murray used was it's a fresh start, and I think that's how a lot of players look at it. They're looking at Sunday as an audition of sorts for whoever the next head coach is. Obviously when you have as disappointing of a season, and not just loss after loss, but embarrassing loss after embarrassing loss like the Eagles had, something just needs to change. You want to feel something different. You want to feel like you're going into a different direction. So I think it's as much to do with simply Chip being gone and, the head coach responsible for that mess being gone than necessarily Pat Shurmur and how he interacts with the players.
There's been a lot of differing opinions, Josh, about who should become the next head coach, whether it's an offensive guy, a defensive guy, a guy who's in the media, a guy who's a coordinator. Looking at this roster as it stands, what do you think is the best type of coach and type of system to bring out the best on this roster?
Well, I mean, obviously one name that's been linked a lot has been Sean McDermott and his past in Philadelphia, and the fact that he's familiar with Jeffrey Lurie and the city. Just what he's been able to do with that Carolina defense. And I think one thing that will help him is Josh Norman. Josh Norman was a guy, people didn't expect him to be good at all. He was a 5th-round pick, and if the Panthers didn't take him, he could have easily slipped even farther than that. So I think that ability to identify talent, because no head coaches in the NFL currently have come in through the scouting department, and Scott McDermott did. So I think that might be an appealing thing for Jeffrey Lurie, that he has that, particularly Josh Norman and a couple of other players on that defense, that he's identified talent and been able to develop it, because that's something that obviously Chip Kelly hasn't done very well in the last few years.
We're talking with Josh Paunil. You can read his stuff at PhillyMag.com. Birds 24/7. Watches a lot of game tape as well. Looking ahead to this matchup with the Giants, obviously the first game, for lack of a better term, was sloppy. It wasn't the best game to watch. We were talking about Jordan Ronan earlier, and he said that it was one of the ugliest games he's seen this year. What kind of game do you think we expect to see this Sunday?
Well, I think it will be very different from the first game, just in terms of how well the Eagles' defense plays against this Giants' offense. I think the Giants only had 7 points, and that was just on their first drive. And the big reason for that was Billy Davis was able to confuse Eli Manning and give him some looks he wasn't expecting. But, he's also shown, Billy Davis, that he doesn't make a lot of great adjustments. And so I think the Giants will come in with a better game plan and execute it well. And they'll be able to put up some points against this Eagles defense that not only has been struggling, but when you have a coach fired, right as you're about to finish the season, what's going to be kind of the emotions of the team. Maybe they'll be more motivated because it's an audition. But firing Chip Kelly, certainly, I don't think it's going to make the locker room come together at all. I think, if anything, it's kind of dividing the players in between the guys who like Chip and the guys that didn't like Chip. So as much as I think the Giants will take advantage of Billy Davis's scheme and lack of adjustments, I think the kind of the mood of the players and maybe the unity may hurt the team.
Josh, I'm also thinking ahead. I mean, obviously there are some ancillary implications to this game. The loser of this game will have to travel to London to face the Rams. The winner gets to travel to Seattle to play the Seahawks next year, and obviously draft position as well.
Mm-hmm.
Looking ahead of that, which of these two franchises do you think would be impacted more in either of those directions?
Well, I guess I would say the Eagles, just because we know for a fact that they're going to need a new head coach. With potentially traveling to London, and obviously the draft selection or the draft order, that's going to be part of what the new head coach is looking at. Now, no head coach is going to say, okay, I don't want to come here because they're traveling to London. But having a challenge like that, and I think people don't understand just the logistical challenge and, being able to just the practice schedule and all those elements that not just the game but leading up to the game that can be challenging for a head coach. So I think just because the Eagles will have a new head coach, that's going to be more challenging if that happens because of, A, the draft selection order, and B, the logistics of going to London and preparing for that game if they have to.
Obviously, we can't have too much projection about who the Eagles will or will not draft. But looking at the roster as is, considering the fact that you're stuck with contracts like DeMarco Murray's, Byron Maxwell's, Jason Peters, he's probably going to be with the team unless they want to eat some salary and let him go. Looking ahead to the draft, where do you think the Eagles should go considering how they're kind of strapped financially right now?
Yeah, well, offensive line, and offensive line. I mean, this unit, that was, I think, at least one of Chip Kelly's worst personnel decisions was not making any upgrades, especially with two starters departing in this past offseason. As I mentioned before, Matt Tobin and Alan Barber have been dreadful. I mean, and that might even be a positive spin on it. Jason Kelsey, he's been up and down. I think he'll be better next year and return more to form. But Jason Peters, he's had a Hall of Fame career, been an excellent Eagle, but how much left does he have in the tank? So you could potentially be looking at 3 new starters on the offensive line the Eagles need. Even if Peters is back, you're going to need a replacement. Lane Johnson may move to left tackle, but who's the right tackle? I mean, do you want Dennis Kelly playing right tackle for you? So offensive line, but also, as you mentioned, you can't do much really at running back. Defensive backs, maybe something will happen. Walter Thurman was on a 1-year deal, but Eric Rowe has obviously played well, so I don't think corner will see much turnover. Receiver is certainly a position that you could see some upgrades. And defensive line is something that I'm interested in. I don't think they'll take a defensive lineman necessarily in the first round, but with Vinny Curry's expected to leave, you don't know what's going to happen with Cedric Thornton. Who's going to be that third guy on the defensive line if they stay in the 3-4? Because that's been a strength of this unit or of this team. And how will that unit be going forward with potentially losing 2 guys?
Speaking of Jason Kelsey, I wanted to ask you real quick. This is a guy who was a Pro Bowler. He's still young enough that you can improve. And I was talking about this earlier this week on the air, and that is watching him play, it just seems like the weight loss has just so affected his ability with his footwork to be a pass blocker. How much do you think that him, maybe getting some new coaching, maybe spending the offseason getting stronger again, can really put him in a position to get back to that Pro Bowl form?
Yeah, well, I think one kind of matchup that really exemplified how just kind of his current size affects him is going up against Terrence Knighton against Washington on Saturday. He really struggled kind of, in small spaces against him on those inside zone plays. He really couldn't get movement on him. Now, granted, Knighton is one of the biggest guys that Kelsey will ever play on a regular basis, but when you have those matchups, and even guys who may not be as heavy as Terrence, you're going to want him to just have a little more size on him so he can handle that, because there are going to be big nose tackles or defensive tackles that you have to face, and that's something that you obviously want your center to be able to handle. But also I think one thing that will help is when he gets better guards around him. I think he may have felt more pressure or more of a need to kind of overperform or overthink things because he didn't have 2 talented guys next to him. So I think that's also something that could help, is if the Eagles get improved offensive linemen surrounding Jason Kelsey.
And then flipping it over, obviously the offensive line, we see it around the NFL. You could probably count 15 teams in the NFL that have horrible offensive lines. And, the Eagles, they're probably in that category. Obviously the Eagles need to upgrade their offensive line, but how much do you think improving the offensive line is going to matter in the long run? Because obviously, what is the offensive line's most important thing they do? They open holes for the running backs and they protect the quarterback. So it almost doesn't matter who the Eagles' next quarterback is if the offensive line can't block.
Exactly, and that's one of the reasons why I was, kind of shocked that Chip Kelly wouldn't upgrade that offensive line when, you bring in a new quarterback with injury-prone history, and you bring in a new running back who you're dedicating a lot of money to in DeMarco Murray, and a second running back who also has an injury history. So you would think that you want to invest a lot of resources in a unit that will pass protect the quarterback and open up lanes for the running backs. So, that's absolutely the problem is if Sam Bradford leaves and you don't make improvements to this offensive line, what quarterback would want to come into this situation where there's not a lot of talent at receiver and he knows he's not going to get good pass protection? It's unfortunate to say, but, once Sam Bradford got that concussion, it almost felt inevitable because, they had 10 quarterback hits that game, which is, an unreasonable and a ridiculous number for the offensive line to give up. What do you think is going to happen when you give up that much pressure and that many hits? So without an improved offensive line, how much can you bank on the rest of the offense improving?
Josh Paunil, Eagles 20, Birds 24/7, PhillyMag.com. Appreciate you joining the show. Happy New Year, and we'll catch you next week as we wrap up the Eagles season.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Enjoy the new year.